And while people are thinking of some questions, Gianna and Abby, if you want to maybe tell us one of maybe your favorite things about going abroad, why you wanted to go.
So, yeah, I guess I can go first. So I visited France when I was a lot younger, and my dad lived over there briefly when I was in middle school and high school. And I mean, we hadn't really gone that much, and I had always wanted to learn more about French culture, live with a host family. And then my older sister, she studied abroad in France and she loved it. She lived in Paris. And so I was looking kind of for like living in a smaller city and just kind of getting to know the culture a little bit more. Since I do have French citizenship, just kind of learning more about where my family lives and where they come from, where they spend a lot of their time.
Yeah, I would say about I had similar experiences. My family is from Vietnam, and we're part of the refugee population that immigrated after the war. And so I've been to Vietnam now 3 times. And so I went when I was very young. I graduated high school, and then I went as a sophomore in college. And so each time besides the time I visited as a child, I found that I was learning more and more about the country and about where my parents come from, thanks to being able to visit there. And so that's kind of what motivated me to go my sophomore year. And then in terms of why I studied abroad in London, or why I studied abroad in general, I think there's nothing that really beats being able to live in a new place and being able to take classes there and live there. It's very different than traveling there to a place for maybe a couple of days or even a couple of weeks. You're really immersed in the culture when you're studying where they're studying and living where they're living. And it's a very different experience. And my sister also studied abroad when she was in college. And so that was kind of what motivated me to go for it and try it out myself. And then why I chose London is kind of the fact that it is such a large city and I don't have much experience in a big city. Like I said, I'm from Greensboro and have always been from Greensboro, and Chapel Hill is also very small. And so London is just very, very different. And I wanted something very different. And I wanted something or a city that would have a lot of cultural diversity, and I wouldn't, necessarily feel stuck or, kind of tired of one place. I could just kind of go around the city and experience something new every day. And yeah, that was my reason. And then I definitely don't regret either experiences at all. If any of you have the opportunities to travel or to study abroad when you're in college, I definitely highly encourage it. Yeah, I can't say that I regret anything from my experiences.
All right, we've got a question about immigration in the Q&A. Are you able to see that, Abby and Gianna, or no?
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah,
Okay,
I can see it.
so the question is, how strongly do you think that the media in each country really sways or promotes negative ideas about immigration? And how do you think we can combat that?
Yeah, so I can kind of start answering this question. So just honestly, in any country, but in particularly in France, you see a lot in the media, just kind of as I mentioned in the presentation, a lot of like far right, extreme, like kind of populist parties are promoting this image of immigrants, kind of capitalizing on like anxiety and fears of just native populations, thinking that they're going to be a minority in their own country, and that all these foreigners are coming in and going to be stealing all the economic opportunities and different things like that. And so I feel like a lot of political parties do this in the media, and then even just more conservative, like news outlets will also kind of talk about like the immigration and like kind of the fear. And so that just kind of creates an environment of people who just want to kind of be in their own bubble. And so in terms of kind of combating that, I think it would be important if you see something online about people talking negatively about immigration, and to try to find out all the information first and check other news outlets, see what other people are saying, kind of do some research yourself, and don't just kind of believe the single story you're seeing online. And if someone says immigration's bad and like lists all these reasons, it kind of associates it with all these negative things, then I think you should sort of try to learn as much as you can about the situation before you judge, or just kind of take information at surface level.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Gianna. There is that sense of xenophobia, like she said, in English media as well, especially given, I don't know how many of y'all have heard about Brexit. I can't go far into that with it because honestly, it's very confusing even for me to understand. But while I was there, there was lots of protest and lots of issues and conversations surrounding Brexit and whether or not the UK should exit from the EU, the European Union, which there's opinions on both sides as to whether they should stay or leave. But a lot of the people who thought that they should leave the EU are the same people who think that, who are very anti-immigration. And so it's very much kind of similar to how the US, there's two different sides to a lot of political issues. That's kind of how it was how it is in England. And so yeah, same with Gianna, just, always fact checked, always do your research, and ultimately always support your neighbors and the people in your community by, just being kind to them always. I think sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed with what you might see on the TV or what you see in the news, but ultimately immigrants, just like all people on TV, are people just like we are, and important to always kind of, yeah, do your research before you form any opinions.
Yeah, and I think you guys mentioned this too, of the importance of verifying the news source that you're looking at as well. So there's lots of information on the internet, and some of it is true and some of it is false. So some of you maybe learn about at school how to find, find reliable sources if you're doing research and things like that. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. We've got another question in the chat that is, how do people in London view or respect their history or historical places compared to the US, if you see any similarities or differences there? And yeah, was the difference noticeable in terms of the UK, their connection to history, and US connection to history?
Yeah, I definitely saw that there was a lot of um, respect for their history and the historical landmarks, just because in London specifically, there are many museums that kind of encompass not only London history, but also British history. In general, there's a lot of historical landmarks that are still standing in London, like the Tower of London, and they've been there for years and years. Something interesting too about London specifically is that there was a Great Fire in 1666 that kind of burned the whole city down and erased many of their historical landmarks, and so they kind of had to build from the ground up. And so a lot of what you might see in London now that is considered historical might be post 1666. But there's definitely also, what's interesting too is when I was taking classes, I did take a history class, and it was specifically about Black history in London. Whereas, I've taken African American history as well in growing up in American schools. And something that I noticed that was different is that a lot of the folks in my London class weren't really aware of Black history in London, even though they were from the UK or from England and living in London. Whereas I feel like African American history is a lot more, commonly taught, commonly talked about. And so that's kind of just something that I noticed was different in the way that history is maybe taught in UK schools. I'm not very aware of how or what history they are learning, but evidently there might be some lack of Black history knowledge there. But yeah, I would say kind of that's what I noticed. But aside from that, there's they do have, I guess, an appreciation for their history um, in the overall country.
Yeah, actually going off what Abby said, I noticed something very similar in France. So I volunteered at like a primary school with children, kind of helping them, teach them English and stuff like that. And so they also had like so I guess because American students were helping them, they had like an African American kind of like knowledge day or something, kind of talking about just African American history. And a lot of the kids, like even kids of darker skin color, had no idea kind of the implications of what like that means in the United States, and like how people are treated based off their skin color. That was really surprising to them. And they also didn't really understand like the derogatory terms in the United States for African Americans, because there's just like lack of knowledge about Black history, I think, in French schools as well.
Any other questions about England, France, or Vietnam? And they can be anything at all. You guys have asked great questions so far. And maybe one other question you guys might be able to answer is when you were abroad, what your living situation was is sometimes interesting to K-12 students. So did you do a homestay? Did you live with other students from that country? What was that like?
Yeah, I can get started on answering that. So when I stayed in Vietnam, I was with family, and I was with the family of some of my friends as well, and kind of traveling to different towns by bus. And so I didn't have, because I wasn't really studying or doing anything like that, I didn't have the opportunity to do like a homestay or have a host family or live in a dorm or anything like that. When I was in London, I did have the opportunity to live in a dorm, and it was very, very different from my experience with dorming in the US, just because I was staying, first of all, in my own room, whereas in the US, I was required, or not, usually sometimes you're required to stay with a roommate. But in London, I didn't have a roommate, and I stayed in kind of a suite with 5 other people, and we shared a kitchen and a living room. Whereas in the US, I've never had that experience of sharing a kitchen and a living room with people I was living in a dorm with. So that experience is very different. I actually quite liked the London dorms compared to the US, but I do know that some people chose to stay with the host family because it was a lot more affordable that way. And so we kind of have the option of doing either, but yeah, totally up to you.
Yeah, so for my experience, like I said, I studied abroad in Montpellier, and it's an advanced French program at UNC. So they require you stay with a host family, just so you're practicing your French, just kind of daily conversation outside of class. And so I stayed with a host family. It was a mother and then her boyfriend. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. It was a little difficult just because, of course, you always have to be like ready to speak in French, and like if someone talks to you, then and yeah, and so there was a few cultural differences that happened in the house, but other than that, it was a great learning experience just to be able to try to like kind of be able to speak on the fly and like kind of really, and I think from the experience, I definitely improved my language skills.